There is a word most people are terrified of, and it is not failure. It is obsession. Somewhere along the way, you were taught that wanting something too badly makes you unstable, that focus this intense is a red flag, that the sane thing to do is want things moderately, plan for them politely, and hope they show up on schedule eventually. Tonight, I want to challenge that assumption entirely because the truth underneath it is far stranger and far more useful than anything you were taught in school or at work. The mind does not respond to polite requests, it responds to obsession. And the reason your biggest goal still feels distant is not that you have not worked hard enough. It is that you have never once let yourself become obsessed with it on purpose, without apology, without managing it down to a size that makes everyone around you comfortable. Maybe you have a version of your life you can see with total clarity when you are alone, in the shower, in the car with the radio off, right before sleep when the noise of the day finally quiets down. And then the moment daylight hits, you shrink that vision back down to something reasonable, something you will not have to explain to anyone, something small enough that failing at it would not really hurt. Perhaps right now you are doing everything the productivity books tell you to do. You wake early, you make the list, you check the boxes one by one, and still, underneath all of it, there is a quiet, persistent sense that you are managing your life instead of building it, that you are the world's most efficient administrator of a dream you have not actually let yourself want yet. Maybe you have started that one big thing 4 or 5 times, gotten a few weeks in, felt the initial spark cool off into obligation, and told yourself that discipline was the missing piece, when really something else entirely was missing. Perhaps you have watched someone less talented than you pass you by, not because they worked harder in any measurable sense, but because they were consumed by their goal in a way you have never once allowed yourself to be, and somewhere in the back of your mind, quietly, you have started to suspect that the calm, balanced, moderate approach to your dreams is exactly what is keeping them out of reach. Maybe you have even felt a flicker of that old intensity return late at night, thinking about the thing you actually want, and you talked yourself out of it within minutes, calling it unrealistic before you gave it a single day to breathe. Maybe you have noticed the pattern by now and just never said it out loud to anyone. The people who actually finish things are not necessarily smarter than you. They are not working with more hours in their day than you have. What they seem to carry, almost like a low hum underneath everything else they do, is a kind of fixation you have only ever let yourself feel in private, late at night, before you talked yourself back down into something manageable. Perhaps you have caught yourself explaining your goals to other people using softer language than you actually feel, calling something a little side project, when privately it is the thing you think about more than almost anything else in your life. Maybe you tell yourself you are being humble or realistic or protecting yourself from disappointment, when really what you are doing is quietly negotiating your own dream down to a size that will not embarrass you if it fails. And there is a cost to that negotiation that nobody warns you about, because a goal you have shrunk down to protect yourself does not generate enough emotional charge to actually move you. It sits there, reasonable and safe, and reasonable, safe goals rarely get built. They get postponed, gently, indefinitely, one Tuesday at a time. Here is the uncomfortable truth Napoleon Hill spent 20 years chasing across the desks and boardrooms of America's wealthiest men, and it is this. Every person who ever built something extraordinary was, for a defined period of time, slightly unreasonable about it, not reckless, not unstable, but single-minded to a degree that made calm, moderate people distinctly uncomfortable to be around. Hill studied men who had turned raw ambition into empires that outlived them, and he found the same pattern surfacing again and again in different industries, different decades, different personalities. Before the fortune, before the recognition, there was always a period where the goal occupied the mind so completely that it began reshaping decisions automatically, without conscious effort, the way breathing happens without instruction. That state has a name, and it is the first principle we need to talk about tonight: definiteness of purpose, the foundation everything else in this video is built on top of. Most people treat their goals like a wish list they quietly update every January and rarely look at again. A vague desire to be successful, to be comfortable, to make some kind of impact before the years run out. Hill discovered that vague desire produces vague results every single time, without exception, no matter how hard the person carrying that vague desire happens to work. The men who built lasting fortunes did not want to be rich in some general sense. They wanted one specific outcome, defined with almost uncomfortable precision, and they carried that definition with them into every room they entered. Andrew Carnegie did not wander into the steel industry hoping something would eventually work out in his favor. As a young immigrant working in a Pittsburgh telegraph office, earning almost nothing, he became fixated, almost irrationally, on the conviction that steel would become the backbone of American industry. And he organized every decision he made around that single fixed idea, years before anyone else in his position took it seriously enough to act on it. That is not planning in the ordinary sense of the word. That is obsession with a direction, obsession that had somewhere specific to go. Most people believe that having many interests and staying flexible is what keeps opportunity alive and options open, but Hill proved something closer to the opposite. The people who accumulated the greatest fortunes narrowed their focus until it became almost impossible to distract them from it, and that narrowing is precisely what made the right opportunities visible in the first place, because a mind occupied entirely by one clear purpose starts noticing the exact resources it needs, the way a hungry person suddenly notices every restaurant on a street they have walked past 100 times without seeing. Tonight, before you sleep, I want you to write one sentence, just one, that states with total, almost uncomfortable clarity what you are building toward. Not a feeling, not a vague ambition dressed up in nice language. A specific outcome with a time frame attached to it. Read it aloud to yourself twice, slowly, as though someone else in the room needed to understand it completely. That single sentence, repeated daily, is the seed of everything that follows in this video and in your life. Notice how different this feels from the vague resolutions you have made before. A vague goal leaves you room to quietly negotiate with yourself every morning about whether today counts as trying. A definite one does not offer that exit. It tells you exactly what a good day looks like, which means it also tells you, uncomfortably, when you are avoiding it. Once purpose is fixed, the next principle becomes the fuel that keeps it alive on the days when the evidence around you says it should not survive. And that principle is faith, not in the religious sense Hill is sometimes mistakenly associated with, but as a deliberate working psychological tool. Hill defined faith as a state of mind that can be intentionally induced through repetition. And this is exactly where most people go wrong, because they wait to feel confident before they act, when the actual mechanism runs in the opposite direction entirely. Confidence is downstream of repeated conviction, not the source of it. Henry Ford is the clearest case study of this principle in action. When he committed to building an affordable automobile for ordinary working Americans, his own engineers told him directly that it could not be done at the price point he was demanding. He was told this by men who understood the mechanics of an engine far better than he ever would. And yet Ford held a conviction so fixed, so absolute, that it functioned less like optimism and more like a law of physics he simply refused to break. And he kept his engineers working the problem, week after week, until the impossible quietly became a production line running 24 hours a day. That was not blind hope wandering in the dark. That was a deliberately cultivated certainty that outlasted the doubt of everyone standing around him. What made it durable was not that Ford refused to hear the objections. He heard every one of them in detail from men whose technical knowledge exceeded his own. The difference was that he had already decided before the objections arrived that the outcome was fixed and only the method remained in question, which meant each new obstacle became a design problem to solve rather than evidence to reconsider the entire premise. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should, because it is the exact hinge point where most people quietly abandon a goal, mistaking a solvable obstacle for proof the whole direction was wrong from the start. Most people believe faith means waiting patiently for proof before committing themselves fully to something, but Hill proved that the actual sequence runs backward from what we assume. The commitment itself, held long enough and repeated daily with real emotional weight behind it, is what generates the proof eventually. Here is your action step for this principle. Each morning this week, before you check your phone or let the outside world in, state your goal aloud in the present tense, as though it is already unfolding around you, not as a hope, but as a fact you are simply describing to an empty room. This will feel uncomfortable at first, even foolish. Do it anyway. That discomfort you feel is the old program resisting the installation of a new one, and that resistance is actually a sign it is working. This brings us directly into the third principle, and it is the one most people skip entirely because it sounds almost too simple to matter. Autosuggestion, the deliberate, repeated feeding of instructions to your own subconscious mind. Understand something important here, something most people never fully absorb. Your subconscious does not evaluate whether a thought is objectively true before accepting it. It simply accepts what is repeated with genuine emotion behind it, and then begins quietly organizing your behavior around that accepted thought, whether it serves you or slowly destroys you from the inside. This is happening to you right now, in this exact moment, whether you are consciously directing it or not. Every time you say, I am not a disciplined person, or this is just how I am and always will be, you are running auto-suggestion against your own future, reinforcing a program you never actually chose on purpose. Thomas Edison, who failed publicly and repeatedly on his long road toward the electric light, refused to let the language of failure enter his internal narrative at all. He was famously known for reframing each unsuccessful attempt not as evidence he should quit, but as one more eliminated possibility on the way toward the correct one. That reframing was not naive positivity floating on the surface. It was a controlled, repeated instruction he fed his own mind deliberately, attempt after attempt after attempt, and it is precisely why he was able to continue long after a less disciplined mind would have quietly accepted defeat as an established fact. It is worth pausing on how deliberate this actually was. Edison was not naturally immune to discouragement any more than you are. He simply built a habit of language around each setback before the discouragement had a chance to settle in and calcify into identity, catching the sentence in his own head before it became, I am failing, and rewriting it on purpose into, that particular approach is now eliminated. Over thousands of repetitions, that small linguistic habit became the difference between a man who quit at attempt 200 and a man who reached the one that finally worked. Most people believe self-talk is just background noise, harmless internal chatter that does not really shape real-world outcomes. But Hill proved that repeated self-talk becomes the literal operating instructions your subconscious follows, the way a computer executes code without ever pausing to judge whether the code is a good idea. Your action step tonight is simple to describe, but not always easy to do. Choose one sentence that represents who you are becoming, not who you currently feel like on an average Tuesday, and repeat it slowly, with real emotion behind every word, morning and night, for the next 7 days straight. Do not evaluate whether you believe it yet. Belief arrives later, once repetition has done its quiet work. Repetition always comes first. Now we arrive at a principle that separates the people who dream from the people who actually build, and that principle is organized planning, the translation of raw desire into a sequence of concrete actions with real deadlines attached to them. Purpose without a plan is just a feeling you carry around in your chest, and feelings, no matter how intense they get late at night, do not build companies or careers or transformed lives on their own. Hill discovered that the men who accumulated the largest fortunes were almost obsessive about breaking enormous, overwhelming goals into specific, actionable steps, often revising the plan repeatedly when the first version failed to work, but never once abandoning the underlying purpose itself. John D. Rockefeller, long before he controlled the oil industry from top to bottom, was known for an almost unsettling attention to operational detail, tracking costs down to fractions of a single cent, because he understood on some deep level that the massive vision only became real through thousands of small, organized decisions executed correctly and repeatedly over years. He did not simply want to dominate an industry in some abstract sense. He built a system, refined that system constantly, and trusted the system to carry the vision forward even on the days when motivation was completely absent from the room. What is easy to miss in that story is how unglamorous the actual planning looked from the outside. It was not a single brilliant insight that reshaped an industry overnight. It was a series of small, boring adjustments made repeatedly over years, each one barely noticeable on its own, that compounded into something that eventually looked, from a distance, like genius. The plan was never finished. It was constantly being revised in small ways while the purpose underneath it stayed completely fixed. And that combination, a rigid purpose paired with a flexible plan, turned out to be far more durable than either rigid planning or a wandering purpose could ever have been on their own. This is the myth-busting moment worth sitting with tonight. Most people believe that successful people are simply more motivated than everyone else around them, that they feel like doing the work every single day without exception. But Hill proves something far more useful and far more achievable, that the organized plan is what carries you on the days motivation does not show up at all, because the plan does not ask how you feel this morning. It simply tells you what comes next, one step at a time. Your action step is to take the single sentence goal you wrote earlier tonight and break it into the next 3 physical actions. Nothing abstract, nothing that requires waiting for a feeling of readiness, just 3 concrete steps you could complete this week, even on a day you do not feel remotely inspired. The 5th principle is the one that gives this entire video its title, and it deserves to be spoken about honestly, without softening it, because Hill called it one of the most powerful and least understood forces available to the human mind, the transmutation of intense emotional energy into focused, sustained action, what he referred to in his own private language as controlled obsession. This is not about working 18-hour days out of raw anxiety or fear of falling behind. It is about a specific, deliberately cultivated mental state where desire becomes so concentrated that it begins directing your attention automatically, the way a magnet organizes iron filings without ever touching a single one of them directly. Hill observed that nearly every man he studied who achieved something extraordinary passed through a defined period where the goal consumed their imagination almost involuntarily, where ordinary conversations, casual reading, even completely unrelated problems somehow kept circling back to the central purpose sitting underneath everything. This is not a rare personality trait some people are simply born with while others are not. Hill was explicit, again and again across his work, that this state can be deliberately cultivated through the very principles we have already walked through tonight: definiteness of purpose, sharpening the target until it is razor thin, faith and autosuggestion, feeding the emotional charge behind it daily, organized planning, giving the obsession somewhere productive and specific to go instead of burning out uselessly as free-floating anxiety. Carnegie himself was known to think about steel production even during moments meant entirely for rest, not because he lacked balance in the conventional sense of the word, but because the goal had become so definite and so emotionally charged that his mind simply would not release it, the way you cannot stop thinking about a song stuck in your head. Except this particular song was quietly building an empire in the background. Most people believe obsession is inherently dangerous, something to be carefully managed and suppressed in favor of a calmer, more balanced life. But Hill proved that controlled obsession, aimed correctly and fed by a real, organized plan, was one of the primary engines behind nearly every fortune he studied across 2 full decades of research. The danger was never intensity itself. The danger was always intensity aimed at nothing in particular, burning without a direction to travel in. Your action step tonight is to stop apologizing for how much you actually want this. Stop performing casualness about a goal that genuinely matters to you when no one is watching. Let yourself think about it in the shower. Let it follow you quietly into unrelated conversations. That is not instability. That is the exact mental fuel Hill spent 2 decades of his life carefully documenting, and it is available to you tonight in exactly the same quantity it was available to any of the men we have talked about so far, waiting only for you to stop diluting it out of habit. There is a 6th principle worth naming tonight because it is the one that determines whether everything we have just covered survives contact with real life, and that principle is persistence. the willingness to keep feeding a purpose long after the initial excitement has completely worn off. Hill noticed something almost universal among the men he interviewed, that persistence was rarely dramatic in practice. It did not look like heroic last stands or dramatic comebacks staged for an audience. It looked like quiet, unglamorous repetition, showing up to the same unfinished plan on a gray Tuesday when absolutely nothing about the day felt significant. Rockefeller endured years of thin margins and setbacks that would have ended most ventures before he ever controlled a fraction of the market he eventually dominated completely. What kept him moving was not a constant supply of fresh motivation. It was the decision, made once and reinforced daily through the principles before it, that quitting was simply not an available option on the table. Most people believe persistence is a personality trait. Some fortunate people are simply handed at birth, while the rest of us are left without it. But Hill proved that persistence is actually the natural byproduct of definiteness of purpose, combined with faith and autosuggestion working together quietly in the background. When the purpose is truly definite and the mind has been fed that purpose repeatedly enough, persistence stops requiring willpower altogether and starts functioning more like a habit you do not have to fight for. This is genuinely good news because it means you have been asking the wrong question every time you have wondered why you cannot seem to stick with anything. The question was never whether you have enough willpower. Willpower is a limited resource that depletes over the course of a single day, and no amount of it was ever going to carry you across months or years. The real question is whether the purpose underneath the effort has been made definite enough and fed to your own mind consistently enough that continuing simply stops requiring a decision each morning. Your action step here is to identify the exact moment in your current effort where you have historically given up in the past and decide, right now, tonight, before that moment arrives again, exactly what you will do differently when it does. There is one more principle worth walking through before we shift into something more personal, and it is the one that quietly decides whether all of this ever becomes real or simply stays a pleasant idea you thought about for a week, and that principle is decision, the ability to commit to a course of action quickly and definitely, and then refuse to reopen that decision every time doubt shows up uninvited. Hill made an observation that surprised him when he first documented it, that the men who accumulated great fortunes tended to reach major decisions quickly and change them slowly, if at all, while the people who never built anything of lasting significance tended to do the exact opposite, deciding slowly and reluctantly, then abandoning the decision the moment the first sign of resistance appeared on the horizon. Think about how you currently make decisions about the goal sitting closest to your heart. Do you decide once with conviction and then simply execute regardless of how each individual day feels? Or do you quietly reopen the decision every single morning, relitigating whether this is really worth it, whether you have what it takes, whether today is the right day to finally begin? That constant redeciding is exhausting in a way most people never name directly, and it drains far more energy than the actual work ever does. Carnegie was known among his peers for making enormous decisions involving fortunes and futures, in remarkably short windows of time, not because he was reckless with the details, but because he had already done the deeper work of definiteness and faith long before the decision point ever arrived, which meant the decision itself became almost simple by comparison, a formality rather than an ordeal. Most people believe that agonizing over a decision for weeks demonstrates seriousness and care. But Hill proved the opposite pattern held true among the men he studied, that prolonged indecision was itself a symptom of a purpose that had never been made definite in the first place. And that speed of decision, once the groundwork of purpose and faith had been properly laid, was actually a sign of clarity rather than carelessness. Your action step is this. Identify one decision related to your goal that you have been quietly reopening for weeks or months without ever closing it, and close it tonight, permanently, out loud, so you can stop spending energy on a question that was never really the point. I want to be honest with you for a moment, away from the teaching entirely, because I think you deserve that before we close tonight together. I have sat with these same principles during long periods of my own life when they felt like nothing more than theory, like ideas that worked beautifully for other people in other eras with completely different circumstances than mine. There were stretches where I said my goal aloud in the mirror and felt nothing but quiet foolishness looking back at me. There were nights the plan sat untouched on my desk because the day had already taken everything I had left to give. And I want you to know honestly that the men Hill studied were not immune to any of this either. Ford faced real bankruptcy before the empire ever existed. Edison faced public ridicule in the press before the breakthrough finally arrived. Carnegie started as an immigrant with nothing but a conviction nobody else around him shared or even understood. The difference was never the absence of doubt creeping in at night. The difference was that they kept feeding the purpose anyway, on the days it felt completely real and on the days it felt like nothing at all, until repetition quietly did what motivation alone could never have done. I think part of why we resist obsession so strongly is that somewhere along the way, we confused it with instability. We watched people burn out chasing things for the wrong reasons, aimed at nothing but proving something to someone who was never really watching, and we decided the safer path was to want everything a little less. But there is a difference between burning out and burning with direction. And the men we talked about tonight understood that difference instinctively, even if they never had language for it. They were not running from something. They were running towards something so specific that the running itself stopped feeling like effort and started feeling like the only sane way to spend the days they had. That callback matters, so let me say it again plainly, one more time, because you need to hear it twice tonight. The mind does not respond to polite requests, it responds to obsession. And you are allowed, starting tonight, right now, to want something with your whole chest instead of carefully managing your ambition down to a size that makes other people around you comfortable to be near. Here's the line I want you to carry out of this video and into tomorrow morning with you. A mind that has been given one clear, obsessive purpose stops asking whether something is possible and starts quietly asking how. In the next 24 hours, I want you to do one specific, concrete thing. Take the sentence you wrote tonight defining your purpose and place it somewhere you genuinely cannot avoid seeing it every single day: your phone lock screen, your bathroom mirror, the inside cover of the notebook you open every morning without fail, not as decoration sitting in the background. As a repeated instruction to the part of your mind that is always listening, whether you are consciously directing it or not. Say it aloud once more before you sleep tonight, with the exact same intensity you would use if it had already come true this afternoon. And if something in you resisted while listening to this tonight, if some quiet part of you felt that old pull toward wanting something that badly again, do not talk yourself out of it by morning like you have done so many times before. That pull is not naive. It is the exact mechanism Hill spent his entire life documenting, finally waking back up inside you after however many years it has been asleep. You do not need permission from anyone else to let it stay awake this time. You do not need the goal to look reasonable to people who were never going to build it alongside you anyway. You only need to keep feeding it, the same sentence, the same conviction, the same 3 small actions, again tomorrow, and then again the day after that, until the mind stops asking whether this is possible and simply gets to work figuring out how. Before you go tonight, I want one word from you, just one, in the comments below this video, the single word that represents what you are committing to becoming obsessed with starting right now. Not a paragraph explaining yourself. Not a justification for anyone else reading it. Just the word alone, because naming it tonight is the first repetition. And repetition, as you now understand completely, is where every single thing we talked about tonight actually begins.